Just to set up, is it cut off in the middle points? Like you were saying, you see it differently to whether they would want to have members of
Yeah,
parliament.
we're talking about no taxation without representation. I
Yeah,
read this in a book by a historian, Gordon Wood,
yeah,
and the kinds of representation the Americans were talking about was not the same idea of representation as the British had. I shouldn't. I mean, sorry, this is a misleading terminology because everyone thinks they're British. So,
yeah, yeah. Okay,
that's
yeah.
just a caveat
For
to make.
the sake of making
So,
it for the listeners, yes, we'll use Americans and British, just even though they
well,
weren't.
we use Americans, but everyone is British here, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
the British in the colonies,
yeah.
13 colonies. What they actually are suggesting is a really radical view of representation that no one had really taken seriously before this point. I think that's an easy point to miss.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, if I can. I mean, I have to recall this information from the dim recesses of my memory, but suggesting, the British point of the British point of view back at home in the mother country, the point of view is you are represented. Parliament represents you, right?
Yeah.
Like, is every Englishman, Englishman represented in there by their local MPs? I don't really think. I mean, there's rotten boroughs. There's a whole complicated system of representation. It's not.
There's very limited democracy in Britain at this point.
Exactly. That's
More
right.
of a theory, an ideological theory than it is.
Well, one has to take it seriously because compared to other places, it is very democratic.
Well, yes.
For the time, right? So let's compare it to France or to Spain or to Germany's
it was zero democratic.
But yeah, Britain is pretty far ahead, I think, in that respect. But the British in America, as usual, they're pretty radical people.
Yeah,
I think they have come from many of them, not all of them. You have these Virginia aristocrats as well, but they are proposing a really, at the time, I think would be quite a radical view of representation, which I only think in later history, because we've accepted the colonial view of representation now, and that's now part of our political discourse.
Yeah, that's
we take that for granted.
That this was new.
So,
like what we take for granted now as democracy was completely alien to everyone when they came up with it.
Yeah, so I don't think it's the British fault that they didn't realize, that they weren't representative enough, or that they didn't take into account some, from the British point of view, some kind of bizarre view of representation. Okay, so that's the other point I have.
But on a practical level, though, do you think the Americans actually really wanted representation in Parliament? Or do you think
I don't know.
As a justification for not paying the taxes?
I don't know. I think that's a hard one to answer. But it is striking how little the taxes are. I mean, they're getting taxed a lot less than people in England.
Yeah.
So is it a question of principle or is it a question of material goods? That's something to think about, I suppose.
Do you think they are really ideologically principled, or do you think it was economic interest that became ideological principled, or was it always economic interest?
I'd be inclined to emphasize the ideological interest over the economic ones.
From the beginning, or just it morphed into that?
I think there were points where it was significant. I mean, there was a sort of, would you call it a recession?
Yeah.
There were difficult times. That was around about the time of the Townsend duties, I believe. Okay, so sure, that has an important effect, but I think it's really the way that these changes are being interpreted through a pre-1688 Whig lens, and particularly a Protestant one in many cases. I don't think it's a coincidence that Boston is the center of the revolution later on. But yeah, let's see.
Well, that comes in with the Great Awakening, obviously, because they had that resistance to authority from the Protestant Reformation, the Great Awakening. They then turned that on to political. It's interesting that my dissertation in my undergrad was how Virginia was the driving force for the revolution. And like the great ironies of history is that the governor of Virginia died just after the Stamp Act resistance, and a new governor was sent out. And if you look at the parliamentary records of 1765, 76, they're talking Virginia, 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 Virginia. There's nothing about Massachusetts at all.
Yeah.
And then the new governor was sent out and they said, is it all right? And it wasn't, but he wanted to look like he was doing a good job. So he said, yeah, there's no problems here. We've got no issues. And the governor of Massachusetts was very weak and was struggling with local problems. And he said, we've got an issue here. Can you call in the army? And the army got sent there and the Boston Massacre happened. So the interesting thing is, if it wasn't for that quirk of fate of someone dying and then them covering their own backs, whether it would have even gone that far. But I mean, even among the colonies, they saw Massachusetts and Boston as radical. Like if you look at New York colonists were like, we're not joining these nut jobs in the North's like revolution unless Virginia does. And so like everyone sat and waited for Virginia because I think they saw Virginia as like more rational. And when Virginia sided with Massachusetts, that's when because obviously then you put the two biggest elements in, it kicked off. Do you think there is a possibility that it was more ideological in New England and more economical in Virginia? Or do you think the ideology was evens all through the colonies?
Oh, that's a good point. I'm not sure. To be frank, I'd only be guessing if
because it is like just a quirk of fate that the biggest events like Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party happened in the most ideologically fervent part of the colonies. You know what I mean? So they then get mixed up as in it was ideological, just because it happened in the place where the ideology is most important.
Although I think was it from the time of the Townsend duties that they put the customs house in Boston?
Yeah, they did. Yeah,
as well. So
that makes sense. You think about from where was most of the trade?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. But it does end up being the kind of focal point of a lot of colonial anger.
Yeah. Do you think also that might have come from the mercantilist system? Because obviously, like the North wanted to manufacture because they were starting to develop in Boston, they couldn't. So there was still that economic restraint that the mercantilist system wasn't allowing them to trade with other places. They couldn't get their sugar from the Caribbean, from other islands that weren't British anymore. Whereas the South was still benefiting from the system because they had a guaranteed market to export their tobacco.
Yeah, quite possibly. I could be convinced by that.
Yeah. All right. Let's look at the Townsend. So the next thing they did, obviously, was the Townsend Duties in 1766, which I think is completely pointless. So they did.
Really, I thought they were pretty important.
They're important, but I think it was pointless of the British government to do it. It's more like my judgment of Britain why they did this.
Yeah.
Because the new government came in and they were like, having the Declaratory Act is not enough. We can't just say we have the right to tax. We have to actually do it. So this is like in your analogy of the teacher being like, I'm saying I've got authority. I need to prove it, but I'm going to do it in the most petty and pointless way that I can. So they introduced duties on tea, wine, glass, like china, paper. I can't remember the other one. And they're all things that the colonists can't import. They can't manufacture because they're not allowed under the mercantilist system.
So can we run? I really like this metaphor of the teacher in the classroom. So basically, you've laid down a rule.
Yeah.
You've taken it back.
Yeah.
You've, in theory, declared your authority over your unruly students.
Yeah.
And now you've decided to impose another rule on them.
Yeah, a pointless rule just to prove you can. and then like the students are obviously like, we're not having any of this. We can beat this teacher back. So if you're looking at it on that sense, it's like coming in. It works well as an analogy. So they've taxed these. They've basically picked 6 things they can't manufacture themselves, not because they can't, because they're not allowed to. So that really probably reminds them of the fact that a mercantilist system is restricting them. These things raise virtually no money whatsoever. They're just designed to prove a point that they can tax. They pull the idea, obviously they tax import exports because the colonies can't manufacture this. They're going to have no choice but to pay it because they have to import it. So they're being forced into it. It's not that they can get around it. And they say, well, the Americans made the distinction that the Stamp Act was an internal tax. This is an external tax on trade, therefore it'd be fine. Although Burke had said that the Americans no longer saw that distinction. He was like, they don't see the distinction between external and internal. You're going to annoy them. There's no point to this. Why are you doing it? And then they also bring in the Board of Customs Commissioners is set up in Boston. So obviously that's designed to make sure that the people are paying their taxes. Boston is the main port area. It was already causing problems. It was the main import of molasses, sugar from the Caribbean, where they made rum. So like putting it up there is going to annoy them, and it leads to that being a focal point of the revolution. And the Quartering Act is enforced in 1765 to mean that they have to hold British soldiers. Now, if the Americans are seeing the soldiers as despotic, the fact they've now got to have them in their houses doesn't fit very well with them. And New York obviously is the most loyalist. The irony is the most loyalist colonies are the ones that weren't British. So New York was Dutch, obviously Pennsylvania, a lot of Germans, Delaware, Swedish, and it was these middle colonies that remained most loyal to the crown, which is kind of suggests that Britishness in this period is being British is being rebellious, basically, because like effectively the colonies that were used to being in systems where they were more subservient to their rulers stayed in line, and as did Quebec, which is kind of the great irony. It's like the non-English ones stayed loyal to the English crown, and the English ones rebelled, saying they were English. So
well, not a coincidence. Not a coincidence.
And we can talk about it afterwards. New York. You can take a note of it if you want. You want to come back to it. Whatever I'm saying, you can come back on it. New York refuses the Quartering Act. It's the only state that does, because they've got a colony rather, because they've got more soldiers on their territory than anywhere else, because it's where the British base their military headquarters. So they suspend their assembly, which is the first time. And that's like, again, for the colonists, I think it's like Massachusetts suspending New York's assembly. It's like you have no right in this colony to suspend stuff. But New York gives in. And New York eventually says, all right, fine, if you're going to suspend our assembly, we'll accept the Quartering Act and welcomes in the soldiers. So the British think this is fine. I think one thing of the Border Customs being set up in Boston, I think that they were already annoyed by the Vice Admiralty caught up in Nova Scotia. So I don't think that would have had as much of a significance. The fact that New York eventually agreed to take the troops suggests that it was less important. And the merchants didn't want to jeopardize the trade. So because this was external, they were like, well, this isn't actually that much money. Do we really want to kick up a fuss? And this is why I think that if you're leaning towards ideology being more important than economics, I would say that they only kick up when there's actually a direct impact on them. They don't fight it as much as they normally do. Of course, there are boycotts set up for the first time. So this is the first time they really set up boycotts on the side part. And the John Dickinson writes letters to a Pennsylvania farmer in response to this, which is obviously then putting in literary form, no taxation without representation. That gets distributed throughout the colonies. And I think that leads to a significant rise in the ideological. So I think the ideological kickoff, because although Patrick Henry said it in the Virginia Resolves, I don't think that would have been as widely published. So I think like Letters to Pennsylvania Farmer is significant for taking this ideological argument out of what I would call the educated elites in a small circle into the wider population in general. And then we'll talk about that. And then eventually, if you're looking at the repeal of it, there's resistance. The resistance is slow in building up. But eventually, the British repeal it again, only they leave one tax on tea to prove their point that they still have the right to do it. So it still feels like a teacher who's like getting whooped and is basically like, I still have like one thing that you can do, you know, the Tea Act. The Tea Act, not yet, but the tax on tea will keep. Which obviously leads to consequences later on. How important?
I just have to say that as a tea lover, I find that the Boston Tea Party the most horrendous thing.
Well, you're like
that happened out of all.
Edmund Burke and Pitt found that horrendous. Throwing tea in the tea for them was like horrific. Yeah. And how important do you think the Townsend duties?
I'm glad you said it. I didn't know that, but I admire Edmund Burke. I think Edmund Burke is probably one of the smartest guys. Out there. I think maybe he knew what was in the wind.
Yeah, well, he was on. He knew all the time. He said, "Why are we annoying them for no reason?" And they're right. They're British. He was like, if someone did this to us, we would do the same. Do you think him being Irish makes a difference? Because he was obviously in an oppressed colony anyway.
Maybe. I think,
he understood what it's like to be under
possible.
oppressed background, because Burke himself was Irish. So he would have been like, I know what you're doing in Ireland. I know what this is doing. You're doing the same thing. Not a good idea. It's further away, harder to control. There's more of them.
Yeah. I think I put the Boston Tea Party on the second row next to
We'll
the
come back to
Townsend
Boston
duties.
Tea Party. We'll come back to it. But where'd you put the Townsend duties?
I put the Townsend duties pretty high up. I put it second.
Oh yeah,
second
why?
ranked. I think that that they're nothing. That it's not in the same inflection point that the Stamp Act was. But I think that from people are irritated enough that the Townsend duties really begins this positive feedback loop that leads to war.
Yeah.
I think from the Townsend duties, the problems of enforcing it, there's now a cycle. There's a cycle of British attempts to assert their authority, sending troops, resistance to those troops, and then sending more troops. And I think from this point, into some kind of rebellion is starting to become more likely.
Yeah, I think that they're still. Do you think the fact that they're both repealed matters, or do you think the fact which matters more, that they were both repealed or that they left the Declaratory Act and their little pathetic tax on tea?
What's that? Sorry.
Which matters more? Do you think the fact that they repealed them both, or the fact that they left their Declaratory Act and their little pathetic tax on tea?
Well, I think the fact that they repealed as I said with the Stamp Act, I think the fact that they repealed both is proof that they were that resistance was dramatic.
Yeah.
That these things were really inflammatory.
Do you think the Townsend duties had a point? Or is this really just being irritating for no reason?
I think they did. I think they did have a point, but again, we're looking at it through a lens that I don't think the people making the decisions in Britain were looking through. No. I think they had a bunch of concerns. I think the Townsend duties were related to other problems. I think particularly the East India Company.
That was a little later, because that was the Tea Act, I think, when they brought in that's what led to the Boston Tea Party. So the East India Company was all right. This was just literally to tax those.
But the Boston Tea Party is basically an effect of the Townsend duties, right? Because the tax on tea,
because they left that tea tax on,
yeah. So that the tea tax was there, and then they repealed all of the other taxes. They left the tea tax.
Yeah.
Then we have the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah.
Incident. So I kind of see, I see the Declaratory Act as a kind of an effect of the Stamp Act. And I think the Stamp Act is the main issue. And likewise, I think that the Townsend duties is really the important thing. I think that Boston Tea Party, as dramatic as it is, and as heartrending and horrifying, is not, in fact, really the main issue. I think it's a secondary. It's a result of the Townsend duties.
Do you think the Stamp Act and Townsend duties are more significant for the Americans, but the Boston Tea Party is more significant for the British?
What's that?
Do you think the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties are more significant for the Americans, and the British don't realize their significance, but the Boston Tea Party is more significant for the British, and the Americans don't realize the significance of that one?
I think that's a really good point. I think if you have to look at it through two very different perspectives.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at it more through the American perspective.
Yeah.
And that's fine, because of course it's really American reaction which is driving these events. And I think the British are now in a position where they're responding. They're trying to cope with this difficult situation. I think they're losing the initiative. I think the initiative is really with the Americans. But it is, that's right. That's the difficulty.
I'm going to argue that the British were provoking this. I don't think any of their rules had any purpose other than to assert something that they could have got away with. But I think the conflict was inevitable eventually. Like, I think independence would have been inevitable. I think that the only two options were independence or Britain becoming a colony of America.
I don't think so. Yeah, but you know, I think this is a problem in history in general of reading some kind of inevitable set of causal links, right, to a conclusion. I'm not sure that that's true. I think that it could have been like Canada, could have been like other colonies. I think that there's, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not
Do you
sure.
think Canada was more subservient though because they were French, basically, and the French are used to obeying authority?
Sure.
So
Sure.
like, the irony is Canada stayed in the British Empire because they weren't British.
Yeah, right.
I mean,
Yeah.
do you not think there's something in the lines that it was all the foreign colonies were the ones who stayed loyal because they have no tradition of rebelling against authority?
I don't know. I think that's part of the truth. But as I said, I think there are a lot of very articulate, but also quite radical people in the 13 colonies. People like Samuel Adams, for example.
Yeah.
These sorts of types. I think these Whigs, these pre-1688 Whigs, which I keep mentioning, I think all of these factors are important.
Yeah.
For explaining the kinds of really extreme reactions. I don't think most people in Britain could have anticipated this response, nor, for that matter, the level of organisation. I think that's quite impressive, actually, that the ability of the colonies to organise themselves and to unite, to communicate, to work in concert. I guess that's credit to the American British Americans. And I think that's one thing that's always been striking about the US is the ability of Americans to set their minds to particular projects, get people together, and to do it.
Yeah, although I think they kind of winged it, and in the end, I'm not sure they were ever fully united because it led to the Civil War in the end. So I'm not sure, like, you know what I mean, long term, I'm not sure they.
Yeah,
sure. I think the Americans have only ever been united, and I conclude their modern history with this, when they have an external enemy to unite them. They need something to rage against.
Yeah.
If not, they tear each other apart. Whenever they've had no external enemy, they rip each other to pieces.
I don't know. I think that the Civil War, this is 100, slightly less than 100 years later, a very different situation.
Yeah. Now, well, we'll talk about in Unit 4. Get to Unit 4. So, because once the new Republic comes in, we'll look at those divisions and how they impact. I suppose we should get onto this one to make sure we finish it. Boston Massacre, 1770, next thing up. So that killed 5 Boston civilians, obviously, so it provoked outrage in the colonies. It's the first time civilians were killed by soldiers. Colonists believed it had been a deliberate massacre. I think it's a bit extreme. 5 people dead. I think massacre's a little extreme as a point of view, but this shows the American propaganda machine kicking in, I think.
Yeah, were there any fact checkers, James?
No, I would have meant that there were only 5, or that it was a massacre.
Well, I mean, I imagine they would have said that there were a lot more than 5.
Did they? No, I think they just knew it was 5. But I mean, they still just. I think they used the term massacre not so much for the numbers, but so far as they just, for them, it was soldiers firing on innocent people who were doing nothing, as opposed to people that were throwing.
Well, they were throwing snowballs.
Snowballs / rocks.
Snowballs, James. Snowballs are very threatening. They're very threatening.
Well, apparently someone said there were rocks in the snowballs, apparently.
Oh, that's terrible. I'm surprised more people didn't die.
Yeah.
My point of view is that there weren't any rocks, but the snowballs were very tightly packed together. So they could,
Yeah, these British soldiers. Yeah, maybe there wasn't much snow in the south. They weren't used to what is this? Cold winters in the north from Boston.
Yeah, and if it wasn't in Boston, if it was, in Virginia,
yeah,
they wouldn't have a lot of snowballs there.
They didn't have like a children's snowball play. Catastrophe.
It keeps on turning into a kids some kind of kids rebellion, doesn't it? I'm sorry, Americans.
They are
we're
like
not trying to patronize you.
they are like the child that rebelled.
We just we it's our inferiority complex because you know you guys guys have done pretty well.
This confirmed the fears of despotism, obviously, from a standing army, because their fear of the standing army was it would be used against civilians, and these killing of 5 civilians like reinforced that. This was the moment where Burke, who's the great, I think Burke should have just been running stuff. He realized that both sides didn't understand each other at this point.
Yeah, so that I definitely agree with.
Yeah, Burke made his famous quote. He was like, both sides seem to have just made a discovery, and the discovery is wrong. So he said the Americans seem to have discovered that the British are out to create a despotic regime and overthrow them, and the British seem to have discovered that the Americans are out for rebellion to overthrow the government. And he was like, neither of these are true, but they've made that discovery and they're going to stick to it. So I think Burke really saw the idea that they saw completely. I mean, they were just living in different worlds, their perceptions of everything. I mean, one way you could say this was negative. The British government put the soldiers on trial, and John Adams represented them, which I always wonder if that's one reason why they never liked him as a founding father. But he also shows John Adams later, when he was arguing against the British moves to remove murder trials to England, it's like, well, we gave your soldiers like a fair representation, which shows that. I mean, I think John Adams defending the soldiers and getting them 2 guilty of manslaughter and 6 found not guilty, the fact that they were found not guilty, so there was no kangaroo court on it, I think Adams representing them really shows that a lot of these founding fathers are really committed to the ideology of that belief of, fair trial, fair service, when, and that's why they were particularly upset by what they perceived as British, Frenchness.
Yeah, but I think that at this stage, we're now in a feedback loop. We're now at a point where there's a considerable amount of anger. There's a response to that anger. And the things are escalating, I guess, as we would say.
So you would say it doesn't make any difference? Even the killing of civilians doesn't make any difference to the narrative? You think it's already too late?
I think it's too late. I think it's too late by now. Now, I could be wrong. Again, it's easy to read a kind of teleology and say, everyone knew that there was going to be a war of independence. But I don't think people did. I think that I'm not saying that people were clamoring for revolution yet.
Yeah.
I think people would have been. I mean, I think British Americans would have been shocked if you had told them in 1764 or 1765 that in 15 years you were going to be in open rebellion against England. So
they didn't even declare independence. Technically, they were booted out because the king declared them, non-citizens the year before they did the Declaration of Independence. So it was kind of like king said, "You're rebelling against us. You're no longer my subjects." And so they were kind of, and then the violence had actually kicked off, and we'll deal with that in Unit 3. But I think at that point they didn't really have a choice. But even in the second Continental Congress, when they called it, when after the fighting had kicked off in Lexington and Concord, but before Bunker Hill, they sent the olive branch petition to the king to say, "Please, can you sort this out? We don't want to, we don't want this rebellion." And his response was, "I'm hiring German mercenaries, and you're no longer
that's
my
right." That's right.
Which probably wasn't handled very well.
That's right.
Right. So you think it's too late? So it's not as significant for you, the Boston Massacre?
No, I don't.
I would say
unless you want to sell tickets to the Boston tour in Boston. So if you have an economic motive to get tourists to come to your I lived in Boston. I'm putting it so I lived in Boston for 5 years or so, and
they do love that.
I think they love. I think they're very excited in Boston about that. It's the home of the revolution. But
rubbish.
Sorry, Boston.
I think Virginia was home of the revolution. I'll always argue that, but they lost the Civil War. So of course, in America, if you're a loser, you disappear from history. They don't have any losers in their history. If you lose, you're gone. So I think that's why Boston and Massachusetts are headed up as the number one fundamental one.
Yeah.
All right. And then that obviously led. I played devil's advocate. I would say the fact that civilians were actually killed, I think, is big, because then there's that creates an extra level of resentment. whenever civilians are killed, I think you're gonna kick up the level, even if it's only 5. It's still a lot. It's still symbolic. It means that their fear of the army is real. You know what I mean? Because the army has done something that they worried it would do, and I think that's going to make future quartering acts really uncomfortable for civilians.
I don't know, James. I don't know. I think I would say it's more excellent material for rabble rousing.
Yeah, propaganda.
Individuals to make a much bigger deal out of it than probably.
But that is important. Propaganda is important
for
generating the momentum for this, I think.
Yeah.
Because if you look at it, like the propaganda they put up from this is the same propaganda they then put up against the Jane McRae problem in the Saratoga battle in the war, and also against like Lexington and Concord that the British fired first. You know what I mean? It's always like the British did this first. The British did this first. We're always responding.
Right.
And when no one really knows what happened in most of these things. We don't have a clear idea of what happened in the Boston Massacre. We don't have a clear idea of what happened in Lexington and Concord.
Except that the snowballs were well packed.
Well, everyone agrees it was snowballs, but no one agrees it was snowballs with rocks in them or snow, and that makes a difference, I think.
I hope they weren't yellow snowballs.
No, I have no idea. All right, and that led on to the Boston Tea Party, 1773. So this is one where the British, so the tax is still on tea, obviously, but then the British introduced the Tea Act in 1773. The Tea Act is significant because the East India Company was suffering in India. This also goes to show that, like, I think the British viewed India still as a more lucrative part of the empire and more worried about it. So when the East India Company that was obviously privately running India, so this shows again how much business influence there was on the British government, because it's not even a government policy, was failing when they needed to sell their tea. And so the British decided they would make a Tea Act to dump all this tea on the Americans. And and as it's the only thing they're technically paying tax on, it exacerbates the situation because you're bringing everything into the Boston Harbor. And so obviously this was significant. As the ships come in, the Americans are like, you can't unload your tea. Ships are like, we're not going to leave until we unload the tea. So it ends up in a standoff in the harbor with 3 boats. And then the Sons of Liberty, significantly under Samuel Adams's direction, allegedly, though no one can prove it, it probably was. Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, which we'll talk about that as well. What's the symbolism?
Yeah.
And then they went on board. I'll just give the background and let me throw it over to you. So obviously they came on board the ship. They threw the tea into the harbor. This annoyed the British as seen as destruction of property. For the British, this is different. There's one thing to resist paying a tax. There's another thing to destroy someone else's property. And as property is like the key fundamental crux of Britishness on a lot of the ideas, they were really upset with this. I think this escalated the conflict to the point where Britain had to act. Key points you could pull out is the Navy did not respond to the actions of throwing it in the sea because they thought it would make it worse, which I don't know if they had the Boston Massacre in the back of their minds to be like, if we go in again hard, we're going to get the same blowback as the Boston Massacre. And they were obviously put on trial. So they know they won't have the protection of, they'll have to go under the law if they do anything. And I think fundamentally this act was important because this is where Burke and Pitt turn against the colonists, because they're like, all right, you can argue for no taxation, but you can't go around throwing other people's property in the harbor and destroying it. So I think that what is a significant break is, I think the Boston Massacre might mean that there's no longer any Americans giving Britain the benefit of the doubt. And the Boston Tea Party means the British who were giving the Americans the benefit of the doubt cease to exist. So I think these are 2 fundamental events for like hardening the sides and losing like the center ground, the people who were trying to moderate the situation. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I've got the Boston Tea Party at second level under the Stamp Act. Yeah. I was curious about how convincing do you think the Indian costumes were when they boarded that ship?
Not that, but
do you think
are they trying to disguise themselves as Native Americans so that they get blamed for it? Or are they trying to really symbolically represent themselves as something different, as Americans rather than British?
I think it's a very interesting question. I think it's I'm not sure. There maybe somebody knows.
Yeah. Samuel Adams. To go find
do you think how good? Do you think he really looked like an Indian? He was wearing an Indian costume.
No. I would
did it impede
wanted to, they'd have hired Native Americans if they really wanted to look realistic. But
yeah, I guess so.
I mean, I can't believe they would have just like, I think Americans broke in and threw tea. Why would they do that? Like, you know what I mean?
Was it?
It's not very convincing as an argument.
I think it's just it's a lark. Do you use that word? It's a laugh.
Yeah,
It's having fun.
yeah.
I don't know.
But that's going to
it probably would have been enjoyable.
Because having fun by destroying someone else's property is not going to make you any friends.
No, James, having fun by destroying their tea, that is just unacceptable. I mean, if it was their property,
symbolic Englishness.
Even if it was coffee, I mean, that's okay. But tea,
but they wouldn't have been drinking coffee at that time. Come on.
No, but I wonder whether America. Look, I love the United States for many reasons, but one thing that really the US doesn't do well is tea.
That's because they threw it on the harbour. They've got none left.
That's because they threw it in the harbour, and I think the beginning of all of their problems began at that point.
Do you think then they just really don't want to drink tea because they're like, this is the one thing that they're taxing? This is the tea is the symbolicness of Englishness and taxation.
That's my theory, James. Really that's my theory.
Yeah,
that's my theory. I'm sticking to it. And
I think this is the point of no return for the British. I think it really is that the Townsend Duty Stamp Act that really annoys the Americans. The British don't really understand what's going on or why. And I think the Boston Tea Party really irritates the British. And I don't think the Americans understood how much that would have annoyed the British.
Yeah. You don't want to annoy it. You don't want to do that.
No, not with tea.
Not with tea. Not with tea. Like, got a lot of tolerance.
Tea is just. Burke turns against him at this point. I think you can almost follow the strains by Burke's opinion because he's like right on it all the way through.
Yeah.
Because Stamp Act, Townsend Duties, he's like, they're not going to take this. They don't see a distinction anyway. He knew exactly what was going on. Do you think he's the only man who knew what was going on?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, okay, so
he's Irish, that he understands both sides. The power he's a British politician, but he's Irish. So does he understand both the power dynamic and being on the other side of that power dynamic in a way that no one else does?
Look, I'd be hesitant to say that it's just because he's Irish.
Yeah.
It might have an idea. This guy is one of the leading political thinkers in the 18th century. I mean, it's Edmund Burke. It's interesting though.
You know what I mean? He's every stage he knows exactly what is happening.
Well, be careful because he didn't like the French Revolution very much. So,
did he not?
No, he hated it.
Maybe he anticipated Napoleon spreading French doctrine against.
Maybe he did.
He's been right on everything else. I mean, if you put him, Talleyrand was a genius as well at that point. So maybe Burke and Talleyrand, maybe he didn't like Talleyrand because Talleyrand was also able to predict when they sold the Louisiana Purchase that America would be the biggest country in the world in 200 years.
I think Burke was a genius.
Yeah.
So whether that's how much his Irish ancestry has to play, I mean, I don't.
I just wondered if seeing what it's like, he obviously must have seen what the British policies did in Ireland and how that pissed off the Irish now wasn't working. So he must have had, the ability to see that, whereas most of the British elites probably would have never have left Britain. So they would have no idea.
Yeah.
And Britain hasn't been invaded since 1066. They have no idea what it's like to be on the other side of anything. They only know power. They don't know subservience.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's a big problem. Like the British in the imperial times lack humility and understanding and sympathy because they've never been on the other side of it. So you think this is really significant for both sides, or more for the British, or both?
I think for both.
All right, then I'll go on to the other ones. I think these ones are really important, and the Quebec Act I think is fundamentally important. But we'll get onto this. Intolerable acts intolerable acts, as they're known by the Americans because they're intolerable, and coercive acts as they're known by the British because they were enforcing. I mean, by the very name, coercive acts tells you everything you need to know.
Coercive.
Yeah, well, both of them tell you everything you need to know about it. The fact they've got two names suggests at this point the division was finished, and the fact it's coercive to force them and intolerable as in we're not going to take this really suggests that the naming of this act says the split. And the Quebec Act as well. Why I think these are really fundamental is in the Bill of Rights, and we'll talk about the Bill of Rights later on. But if you look at the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments in the US Constitution, they're basically all against these two acts, which to me says that these two acts for them were the real symbolism of tyranny. I mean, you could argue that it was already inevitable, but I think that the tyrannical element of it really comes in here. So the Intolerable Act 1774, they pass through, and it basically takes murder trials are taken to England. Now, that is immediately a shot against trial by jury, because the Americans are like, we no longer have a jury of the peers because the English won't be sympathetic to us.